Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to go over AMD's new 7000 series CPUs, and they're using the Zen 4 architecture with a new logo, nice black and white logo. So basically we have two CPUs on hand, a Ryzen 7 7700X and a Ryzen 5 7500X. We also have the 7950X and the 7900X, but they came in yesterday morning. AMD tossed up how they do their sampling. So they basically sent out two random CPUs, and then later on they shipped the other two right before launch, and mine were overnighted last week, but they came this morning at yesterday morning, sorry, Monday morning, right before launch of the reviews, the embargo lift. Today you can actually buy these CPUs in stores, which is nice, but here's our review of what we've gathered from these two. So we have the 7 and 5, and boxes are simple, to the point, a little bit different from what we're used to, but notice these don't even come with coolers. You need a cooler. AMD suggests a decent air cooler for the 7 and 5, or an all-in-one, of course, but the air coolers are a little bit more expensive, so like a mid-tower air cooler, or something like the NHD15 is fine too. Here we have the CPUs in their packaging, basically very basic, kind of what AMD's always been giving people for a little bit, since they're basically bundling it without a cooler. So you won't find a cooler or anything in it other than this case badge and the CPU. You can see the new CPUs, they're different. They have a different IHS, and it's pretty cool. The integrated heat spreader, it looks like it's like cut out, and it's actually a really cool design. I like how it looks. That's the first thing that struck me about these CPUs, was how it looks. And then also you can see that there are exposed pads over there on top of the CPU, and there's an air gap underneath. You need the IHS to be able to expand and contract for the thermal differences, and the variance on the CPU between like idle and load is very high in temperature, and there's going to be a lot of heat coming out too, because these CPUs use a lot more power. So they need an IHS with a lot of breathing room. That little hole, I guess, could have cut it, but this looks cooler. Anyways, so the bottom of the CPU is a bunch of pads instead of pins. AMD has moved over from PGA to LGA 1718, which means 1718 pins. These are tiny little gold-plated ones. Intel's latest 12th generation, that uses, I think, 1700. But now AMD's switching over to LGA, and for the mainstream consumers, this is the first time AMD is using an LGA socket. But they did, Threadripper uses LGA as well. So for higher pin count or pad count CPUs, LGA is preferred. So here we have our CPU SKUs. Most people have already seen this. Up at 16, but we're testing the 8 and the 6 core. Each CPU CCD, which is a core complex die, the 76 and the 77 have one each, and each one of these dies is a 5 nanometer die from TSMC. It has up to 8 cores, and the Ryzen 9 series CPUs here, they have 2 CCDs. Okay, now underneath the hood is also an IOD, which is an IO die. That's 6 nanometer, I believe, and that has your memory controller, your PCI controller, and also your RDNA 2 graphics are actually on that. So different than Intel, the graphics are not in the CPU die itself, they're separated onto the IOD die, which is pretty interesting. But the chiplets are there. So basically the Ryzen 7950X is basically a double Ryzen 7. You can see the base clocks are the same on the 7950X and the 7700X, and that the base clocks are the same on the 7600X and the 7900X. And yeah, I don't think that's much of a coincidence, because basically they're basically taking the higher bin CCDs and putting them on the Ryzen 9s. And that makes sense. They did that last time too. If we look at the cache, each CCD has 38 megabytes of L3 cache, and then new to this generation, one of the architectural improvements is AMD added 1 megabyte cache locally to each core instead of the CCD. They put it on each core. They basically doubled it. And basically that means that you have 32 plus 8 for the 7700X, and that equals 40, and then if you double that, you get the Ryzen 9's cache at 80 megabytes. So 7600 is 32 plus 6, and that's 38, and then double that, that's 76. You see the TDPs listed there, 170 watts for the Ryzen 9s and 105 for this Ryzen 7 and 5. You're going to be pulling a lot more than that, or the CPU is going to pull more than that. The suggested retail prices are listed there too. I think Micro Center has a deal on the 7900X, but you should see deals coming up. But for now, I mean, it's a newly launched product. I would be surprised if you could find these under SRP. especially because they're probably in high demand. They should be online. You can buy them today. So here are the differences in the architectural contributions, or the IPC contributions that we see from Zen 4. The front end is there. The load store has changed. The queues have been increased. Branch prediction has been increased, or not increased. Its accuracy has probably been increased. Execution units and the L2 cache is discussed. So we're supposed to see a 13% uplift in basically core performance over its predecessor. But we also see huge changes in other regards. We'll discuss those as we go over the benchmarks. Here we use the MSI MEG or MEG X670E. I believe this is an ACE motherboard. It comes with wireless AX, comes with 10 gigabit NIC. It has a lot of USB 2.0, and actually it doesn't have that much USB 2.0. It has a lot of USB 3.0, which is now called USB 3.2, and yeah, it has a lot of that, a lot of USB 3.1, actually more USB 3.1 than USB 3, or with it has a lot more 10 gigabits per second USB. And it also has 20 gigabits per second USB. USB 3.1 used to be 10 gigabits per second. Now they just rebranded it. USB 3.2 is like 20. So yeah, we have a lot of the faster stuff in here. So here we have our first results. We have a Cinebench result, or Cinebench R23. You can see that AMD is pretty much doing well. You have to keep in mind that the 1200K in here, that is 24 threads. That's the only reason it's doing pretty well here. But look at the 7700X, okay? That thing is beating out the 10900K, and that's also with just 8 cores, 16 threads. And the 10900K has 10 cores. The 11900K has 8 cores. So this thing has 8 cores and 16 threads of previous generation, and it's being destroyed. This one has 10 cores right here, and that one's also being destroyed. Now this 1200, that has 8 cores that are for performance, and then a bunch of E cores, 8 of those. So it has 24 threads. So the 8 P cores get doubled to 16 for type of threading, and the E cores just stay 8, so you get 24 cores. So that does help that. Single threaded performance on the 12900K, you're doing pretty good, and then, whoa, AMD actually caught up a little bit. Here we have single core performance doing really well, and look at this, it's beating out Intel's old processors here, and really beating itself out, and in this case it's beating out the 5900X. If we go to the 7600X, we see the same thing here, 1966, 11900K, Intel is at 2037 here, and then Intel, look at this AMD down here, and, this is supposed to be its replacement, and it's doing better than pretty much everything else here, right? Not only that, it's doing better than most everything above it, except for, well, really it's actually doing better than the 12600, but the 12900K is still pretty much up there. So, AMD is doing a lot better in single core, and they're right, or people are right. AMD is doing better in that regards. IPC, yeah, definitely a 13% uplift from the AMD 5000 series CPUs. Here we have Blender results, and I'm in this mode so we can zoom in a little bit. Here we have the 7700X, and it's doing pretty good. It's an 8-core, 16-thread CPU. This thing has like 8 performance cores, 16 threads on that, and 8 extra cores for extra stuff. So, it's even battling it out with the 5950X, and obviously 5950X is doing better, so we expect that. 5900X also doing better, and we expect that as well. Yeah, basically it puts 11th and 10th generation Intel processors like out of business, basically. There's really very little point. Even look at this. Even the 7600X is putting the 11900K on on the sidelines, and the 11900K is kind of using Intel's Sunny Cove architecture in there. I believe they call it Cypress Cove in the 11900K. But it's on 14 nanometers. The 12th generation is using Golden Cove performance cores, and that's on Intel 10, or Intel 7, which used to be called 10 nanometer. But look at this. You have a 6-core CPU from AMD, basically putting the Ryzen 7 5800X on the sidelines. And this is Blender, but this is a benchmark, and it does samples per minute, so higher is better. This is not a Blender benchmark where it gives you a time. and lower is better. So that's not the case here. Higher is better on these Blender benchmarks. So yeah, let's move along. Oh, here's the old 5600X, 5600K, and the 7600K, and you can see there is quite a big jump between the two. All right, Handbrake Legacy, it just means older stuff. This is basically taking a 4K video on normal settings down to 1920, and the average 720p is transcoding it to like MKV or something from MP4. So it makes it more compact. And we can see Intel's still there. Look at that lead it has, but check this out. I mean, it's beating the 5950X. And Handbrake Legacy is a little bit different. It basically it's more mixed. It's not like Blender where it uses all cores so it's maximum. It doesn't put like a maximum load on there. So the results are pretty good. The AMD 7000 series are really shining here. And if we look here, we see the 12600K is still getting beat by the 7600. The Intel Core 12900K is still king, at least in this regards. So Intel is getting caught up too, and that's by the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 7. So here we have Handbrake New. This is using a fast 1080p conversion to 30 FPS, and then a Discord Nitro and a 720. Yeah, down to 720p for like streaming on the side, you know. Anyways, so here we have results again. These two are head-to-head. I mean, I did not expect AMD to be this good with coming up, but I mean, you know, they are charging $400 for the 7700X, and that is more expensive than everything below it. So it should be a really good CPU. It is power hungry, and it is, well, you can say the same thing about the Intels, but it is power hungry. It does get hot, but it's performing. I mean, there's nothing else we can say. These CPUs are running stock, and there have been a lot of things about, oh, the high temperature 95, isn't that going to kick down the clocks? I mean, even if it does kick down the clocks, look at how it's doing. We didn't really see too much of that, though. But we'll take a look here. 5600X compared to the, I almost feel bad comparing the 5600X to the 7600X. I mean, 13%, that's like 26% right there. So, yeah, the 50 and the 37. Well, actually, maybe not. But, yeah. So, things are changing here, but, yeah. So, ADA, floating point, and integer operations per second. Here, Intel has always been really good with integer, and floating point is still around. I mean, Intel CPUs can still do it. But yeah, integer is really good here. Intel's still in the lead. Obviously, the 7700X isn't doing as well as it might be able to do otherwise, but it's still doing quite well. And then down here we have the 76, and so it's fallen more into line here. The 5800X actually beats the 7600X here. But then you get the 7700X, which is replacement, and it totally whoops the 5800X. I mean, will you notice this stuff in your life? Nah, I don't know. Compared to Intel, AMD's doing okay, better than last time. And that can just be achieved by beating out their old ones, but they not even beat them out. They just did as much they could do to, you know, take over. So this ADA memory, as you can see, our DDR5 bandwidth scores are a lot higher. There's a little difference between the Intel and the AMD, and that's down to memory controller differences. Hopefully soon our entire graphs will just be DDR5. Now here's something interesting I wanted to talk about. ADA latency, in the past, at default, the AMD processors have always had a higher memory latency score. This is in nanoseconds, and measured in nanoseconds, so lower is better. Intel's always been lower. However, and now of course DDR5 is going to be a little higher. However, we see something different here. Let's find our 7700. Okay, it's a 75.5, right? That's lower than the AMD ones, and this is 76. But it's also, in this case, lower than the 2900 or 12900K. So it's actually better at default, the 7700X, than the 12900K in latency, and that's not what somebody expected. We would expect this to be higher, but no, they not only met it, they went lower. And then if we take a look at the 7700X and we look at the 12600K, it's also lower. I mean, you can't see the differences like we did on the bandwidth one because this is DDR DDR3 right here, and this is DDR4, and DDR4 right here, and this is DDR5. But yeah, there are some differences. So yeah, keep that in mind. But for DDR5, AMD did revamp some things. So let's take a look at ScienceMark. ScienceMark's real legacy, but you can see some things. Here you see these little bloops, not bloops, but like shootouts here. Yeah, that's because the 5000 series has always done this, right? And the 7000 series done this. The 5000 series does this because the benchmark can't identify the memory architecture, so it defaults to basics. And since ScienceMark's pretty old, it also can't identify DDR4 or DDR5, sorry. So it's basically defaulting on the 2900K and defaulting out on the other Intel CPU. But since it's DDR5, it also can't. It defaults on the 7600X, 7700X. So anything with DDR5 or AMD's 5000 series will default to failsafe, and that's why we have these big bars. Otherwise, we can look at the red. The red is the overall score, and molecular dynamics and cryptography are also in different colors, but the red is more important one. We can see in cryptography there are some changes here and there that are worth noting. The 12600K is 3300, and the 7600 is basically a 38. So it's actually doing better. And overall score, it's also doing better. But it's also doing better than the 5800. And if we go to the 77, we can see that it's doing better in the 12900 and doing better in the molecular dynamics. I think is no, that's cryptography is blue. So right below it, that's molecular dynamics. Intel is doing better there, the 29. And so this is also mixed because the E-cores do come in play here. This is not a 100% benchmark like Cinebench or Cinebench or Blender. So here's SuperPi. Now this is something we did not expect. We didn't expect the 7700X and the 7600X to beat out Intel, which they did. And it doesn't even seem like it was hard. We did notice that the DDR5 latency was lower, so that probably plays a role. And yeah, they did a lot better. We also have a review coming out with higher DDR5 speeds on XMP on basically everything in these charts. Retesting takes a while though, so it's not going to take that long, later this week. So that should be interesting. But here we can see it's doing a lot better. But that's mostly due to its boost algorithms, its high temperature, stuff like that. But yeah, it's doing a lot better in SuperPi. And that's a single-threaded thing, something traditionally Intel has ruled in. But it's not doing so well here compared to AMD. So far we've seen the new CPUs at even low core counts basically displace Intel in memory latency in SuperPi and basically beat out their competition from before and go head to toe with Intel's top contenders right now. Here we have a Unigen engine benchmarks. Here's 720p. Move out the GPU out of the equation because here we're using a RTX 2080 Ti, and for this benchmark it's more than enough. Actually, for more than our benchmarks, more than enough. But here we just want to take that out of the equation. So taking it out of the equation, yep, there we go. Some really incredible results here. This is at 720p. Remember that, okay? I mean, this is. And this is actually the fastest one in our charts here. 7600X is the fastest one. This is a synthetic benchmark though, so let's see what changes when we change the resolution. Now things are getting more interesting. When the resolution changes, we actually see Intel take the lead again with the 12900K. Okay, so the resolution does matter. Just taking it out, taking the GPU bottleneck out of the equation isn't enough to actually see how like real gameplay will be. I don't think anyone really plays underneath 1080p, but a lot of people do play at 1080p and higher, of course. And we'll see that later on, but higher resolutions in actual games, not this engine benchmark. So we can see Intel still has this crown here. And the 7600X almost close to defeating it, but doing actually better than the 7700X. In this benchmark. It seems that this benchmark really likes 6 cores, which would make a little sense. Because, I mean, it's probably optimized for maybe like 6 to 8 cores. So the 12600K, I mean, it's doing well, but it's struggling to keep up with the 7600X, and it is doing better than the 7700X. So the old Intel CPUs, I mean, basically everything is close enough here. Almost everything is in the 9000s, except for a few of them, like these two 6-core Intels down here, the 10th and 11th. But yeah, overall impressive so far. So let's see how it goes. CloudGate from 3D Mark. We can see once again Intel is doing quite well, but also AMD is stepping it up. AMD is coming real close. The 7700X is, I mean, they're like right at each other's throats, and we can see almost no difference. And then the 7600X also doing really well. It actually does lose out to the 5800X, but that's not even supposed to compete against. The score is in red. It's supposed to compete against this, the 5600X, and competing against it, it does do better. So yeah, this benchmark can take advantage of the higher core counts, as we can see. But I mean, it's beating out what it should beat out, and it's coming real close to where it should be. But it's bridging the gap between the Intel and AMD last generation or current generation, but it's not able to beat it out currently. So Fire Strike, let's take a look. So on the Fire Strike tests, we basically see that I mean, everything looks okay here on the 29 and the 77. Intel's still in the lead here. Now if we go down here to the 5600, at the 5600 we're what, right about, we're at 2550 something, and here we're at 30, so this does beat out that. And then it's basically going head to head with the 5800X, but then look at this, it's head to head with this 11th gen. And if we go and look at the 12600, I mean, they're like equal, these. I mean, except for the overall score, which on the 12600 is lower, the other scores are pretty equal. But yeah, it's beating it out, and I mean, 7700X, boom, it's competing against the 12900K, and 12900K has more. So this is more frequency and IPC based than core count. Now, Resident Evil is kind of an older game, but here we can see that, I mean, it's pretty, what I like about this benchmark is it's consistent. Like, you run it and you run it and you run it, and I mean, it doesn't just spit out random numbers. It seems to really tally the count well. And here, 12900K and then the 7700X, it's decent. I mean, the 7700X beats it, and not by a lot though. And then that 7600X, very good too, beating out the 12600, and definitely beating out the 5800. So with the gain Intel had here at this price range over the 5800X, it got basically taken back by AMD with the 7600. So this is a trend that we're seeing. AMD is basically taking back its edge that they had with the 5000 series before 12th gen came out. So 13th gen is coming out. Intel said October, so that's next month. So Rise of the Tomb Raider. Here's what we actually want to zoom in. So Rise of the Tomb Raider, we can see that the Intel is still here really strong, but then boom, AMD kicks in. Higher resolution is in red. As we get to higher resolution, we see things level out, but down here we see like a 10 FPS difference, and then here down to like 1 FPS difference. And minimums are really close too, but the Intel does have higher minimums than the 77. So this bar right here, these longer bars here, the top two longer bars are 1440p, 1080p, and then and then 720p below it. So 1440, I mean, there are differences, but down to 1440 are these, the lower two, my bad. The lower scores are 1440, the high score is 720. So when resolution comes into effect, Intel is doing better, the margin's closing and doing better in minimums here. But overall, I mean, if you just look from a macro view of things, Intel's doing pretty well. So if we go down to the micro level, we can see the old Intel scores. And now we have the 7600 here, basically beating out the 5800X with ease. Minimums are all over the place. Higher here, lower here, higher here, and then 12600K, lower than the, or higher than the 7600, and this is at higher resolution. So at higher resolutions, the Intel still seems to have a little bit of advantage in this benchmark, at least, or Rise of the Tomb Raider. Escalation, the one that we saw, the 12900K had scores that were higher than we'd ever really seen, even with the huge core count chips. This benchmark loves core count, and this game loves core count, and it loves frequency, and the 12900K gave it to it. Now, the 7700K, or 7700X, it is doing a lot better than all the AMD chips. So is the 7600X, so bravo to AMD on that. But they still got a ways to go in catching up to Intel's 13th gen. 10th and 11th gen are basically insignificant at this point. they're not insignificant. They still run the game, and they're still head-to-head with some of the higher core count AMDs. But when it comes to core count matched with high IPC and basically high frequency too, and I think this game just loves high frequency. Um, yeah, they're still playable for sure, but yeah, they're gradually going by the wayside. So here we have a GTA 5, but I mean they've been around for years, the 10th and 11th gen. Anyways, GTA 5 here. Well, they're going by the wayside. I shouldn't have said that. They're just the new CPUs. There's actually a CPU war now. So, and this processor basically confirmed it. The AMD 7000 series confirmed there is a processor war still intact, and that's just win-win for the consumer because you're going to have price competition, you're going to have better performance, but also after a year passes by, your CPU is already out of date. I mean, that's just what happens. So, it's a victim of its own glory. Anyways, the 5950X really getting its bottom handed to it by the 12900K, but the 7700X basically shoves back into the fight, into the ring, and yeah, let me just take a look. Intel is really doing well here, hitting the basic limits of the GPU, I think, and then here we have AMD coming up and saying, wait a second. And yeah, so this is really where AMD is doing well. Gaming, yeah, they really did step it up. And we don't even have our Ryzen 9s in these charts. But we will. I mean, this should be done by tomorrow. The last couple days I've gotten like 1 or 2 hours of sleep. I think on Sunday night I got an hour and a half of sleep. And then last night I fell asleep and woke up at midnight and continued testing. So anyways. So we have our processors here. This is the last benchmark. Here we're going to add power consumption. This is total system. We will do in-depth just CPU, and we'll add thermals and stuff to it too, like thermal imaging. I just want to do total system because we are changing over from a DDR4, different chipset, all the way to DDR5, a different type PCB, much better VRMs for the Intel 12 and the AMD AM5 socket. So we can see here 7700X. I mean, it's not as high as like let's say 10900K with 10 cores, but I mean that's close to the 12900. But I mean, look at this 5950X, 16 cores, really powerful last year, and then boom, this little 8 core comes in and is like, hold up, and then basically Intel was like, you know what, we're gonna pull 274 watts out of our 12900K, and Intel was like, here, hold my drink, while they went and basically, you know, boosted this. And then look at this little 6 core here, 208 watts out of like, what was it, 105 watt TDP? Yeah, okay. So they're basically pulling an Intel on the power consumption. But I mean, at least Intel's being public about it now and upfront, and AMD decided to do the same thing, which we think is good. If you're gonna do this, do it. AMD does have an eco mode to turn it down, and Intel has its own power saving stuff too. So it's not like there's no way to run it lower. It's just that, you know, these are high performance parts. Buy something else if you want to spend like much less on power. And I mean, I got to be fair to those people. My power bill's doubled. I used to pay like I live in like a single bedroom apartment. I used to pay $80 to $100 a month. My power bill last month was $180. It doubled, and that's only from like last 6 months. So yeah, things are changing, but everything is going up and up. So, and it's not always good. But here we have some the Ryzen Master. AMD says the best way to overclock the CPU is through PBO, Performance Boost Overdrive. And it actually is the only way to, I think, overclock the CPU. We did do manual. You can set an all-core CPU overclocking, and we did that too. We found Performance Boost Overdrive, and that one are basically the same. So anyways, you can go to this Performance Boost Overdrive, or you can go to Auto Overclocking. The Auto Overclocking gives you this option to boost override the CPU up 200 watts. You still have the same option, Performance Boost Overdrive, but it's in the BIOS, and they don't call it Auto Overclocking. But under the AMD Overclocking section, you'll find Precision Boost Overdrive settings, and you hit Advanced, it'll give you this option. So I don't understand why there's Auto and Performance Boost. They're both Auto Overclocking, but you have to enable them. Default, you know, is different. They didn't change their boost algorithm, or Precision Boost Overdrive, sorry, not Performance. Whatever, PBO. Scaler on, okay, so in the BIOS you can set this Now the scaler basically, let's say you have a graph like a VF curve, okay, and it goes like this or that, or however you want to do it. So this basically changes the curve so it reports back different values from the internal sensors. So basically, it gives your CPU more headroom. But look at the headroom it's already getting. Platform power, 1,000 watts. Thermal design current, 360 amps. Electrical design current. This is the electrical design current. This means that your VRM is basically told, oh, hey, if you hit 880 amps, stop. 880 amps. Even at 1 volt, that's 880 watts. And that's if it's an ohmic circuit. But like, this is this is just ridiculous. This is basically maxing out. Kind of like you find out in Intel BIOSes, you can set it up to 2048 watts in the CPU on a little 100-watt part. These are the maximums. You're never going to hit these. What you are going to hit is a thermal hit. You're going to hit that on stock in the 7700X. 95 watts. It's not written in stone. It has to stop there. And it doesn't really, it just throttles back a little bit, but not really on the performance. It just, because you're using the OCing through performance of overdrive and auto overclocking, the internal sensors are going to set off alarms internally that are going to basically tell it to scale back the amount of push it's giving it. It doesn't mean it's not going to keep going at a very high speed and drop down to like 3,000 megahertz or something. It's going to basically limit your max. So it's not going to hit it and then drop back, hit it and then drop back, like you might see on when you're hitting like over temperature protection. This is just going to kind of keep it around right below 95. So it's a different type of scale. Anyways, curve optimizer mode. So when you auto overclock, you have an option where you optimize. You can do it per core or all core. On these CPUs, negative 30 on both. I think that's the maximum. You can set your offset to be negative or positive. But basically, this controls the millivolts that drop. And so negative 30 changes that optimization curve. And for voltage, on the voltage frequency curve, this changes that. The actual curve. This one shifts the curve. This one changes the curve. And so basically, the CPUs were getting, I think, 3.6 or 1.36 volts on the 7700X before, and the other CPU was getting 1.35 volts on the 7500X just by default. And the 7600 wasn't hitting 95, but the 77 was, and that's just stock without this stuff. Anyways, this takes it down to a 1.26, and lower voltage here will hopefully result in lower power and or lower temperatures, and that will result. But it's a balance because you need that voltage potential, because voltage is just a potential to allow the movement of current. So basically, you need a little bit of voltage to get the CPU's electrons moving to where they need to go correctly and with enough oomph behind it. But you want to lessen it lower than auto voltages, and this is what lets you do it. So when you go lower, you run cooler, CPU runs faster. And MSI, I think in their BIOS, because we use their BIOS, actually has an option to change that 95 down to 85 or down to 75, and they actually got a few points higher, but that could just been benchmark variance. Anyways, these are the changes that we made in the BIOS for MSI. Here, there's actually a profile that says 170 watt TC 170 watt CPU configuration. This is a 170 watt CPU configuration, okay? And then we go into PBO configurations and we set it to motherboard, and we got advanced, you can set to motherboard. And then this is your ECD, 225 amps, okay, electrical design current, 160 amps on a TDC. Okay, so these are a little bit different. And then power, 230 watts. These are different than the Windows one, but yeah, see, 170 watt CPU, and these are the limits for this 170 watt CPU. We didn't change voltage here. We just use the offset, and here we can see that we set that extra clock to plus 200. That's the maximum it offers. Scaler here we set to 10 because it could handle it, and we did set these to 30. The optimizer we ran, if you do per core, it takes about an hour in Windows, and if you do the optimizer for all cores, it takes about 30 minutes. For us, it just tossed out negative 30. It might be different for the Ryzen 9, so we'll keep you updated on that. And then here's some of the results. So we got much higher scores in R23. So our 7700 or 7600 went to 5.496, 5.5 gigahertz, and it can do this on all cores. 1.3 volts here. We actually bumped the voltage here because it gave us a better score. In this case, the voltage was, the CPU wasn't really hitting that high temperature, so yeah. Yeah. So it's doing okay. It's doing a lot better. It can do that, and it doesn't throttle back down on this. It might limit internal current and stuff, but if it is, the score's higher, so it easily goes higher. Here, we did scale back on the voltage a little bit. That's not the real voltage. The real voltage here was 1.26, and that's so it wouldn't hit 95. Or I mean, it got very close and probably hit it, but this one does 550 on all cores. So yeah, I mean, RAM is fine. Make sure you set this uncore frequency, is also called the U clock. It should be equal to mem clock until you go over 6 or DDR5 6000. This is DDR, is double data rate, so this is going to be 3000 when actual DDR frequency is 6. But then this frequency should be equal to this at 60x and below memory multiplier. So if you're at 6 gigahertz or 6200 gigahertz or 6.2 gigahertz on the memory, and this would read 3200 or 3100 for 6200 megahertz on the memory, this would be half of 31, so it would be 3550. But up to this point, you should be going 1 to 1. Past this point, you go 1 to 1/2. So this would be half of this. By default, we actually had to set this manually to be equal. But AMD is saying that it should be equal on all boards, equal up to that. This is some beta BIOS that we're using from MSI, so we're at latest stuff. Yeah, and I think that's it. So, that's the last of our review, and we gave both of these CPUs editor's choice. The price is a little bit high, and the platform price is definitely high. Same is true for Intel 12th Gen. I mean, if you want the latest and greatest, at this point, we're going over from a generational change in memory, CPUs, architectures. Intel just went to 10 nanometer on 12th Gen, and they went to DDR5 and PCIe 5.0 at once. So yeah, their boards were like $350 a minimum. And here we're going to a new process with AMD, new DDR5 for AMD, new PCIe 5 for AMD. You're also going to look at a very high-end motherboard, and that's also going to cost you a very pretty penny, around like $300, $350. I don't know where those $150 boards are. I'm assuming they're coming out in October when B650 comes out. So as of now, you're going to be paying a premium, and that includes paying a premium on DDR5 because, I mean, DDR4 is still a very viable option, but if you're going to go this route, these two CPUs are really good for it, and the platform will be around for a while, so you can look at it as an investment. Anyways, so we really like the CPUs, and we gave these two both editor's choice. We'll see how the higher core counts go, but we'll be really watching their power dynamics and how they do. And we got more boards in, and we have this board, so if you really like our motherboard reviews, stay tuned. We got a lot of those coming up with a lot of information, and we got some Intel stuff too. So stay tuned, and yeah, any questions or comments, please leave them. Thanks.